It is good to be here with you this week. I really do. I love this stuff, and I'm so excited to spend a few days walking through God's Word together. I'm excited for those of you guys who are graduating to get to spend 4 days with you in the next level. I love getting to do this stuff, and I think it's going to be a good week for us. So, I showed you when I was up here just a bit ago the picture of my fan with my kids. 2 or 3 months ago, I'm taking those kids, my 3 kids, out on this bike ride. And we go to this church. We're a part of this church called Sunnybrook Christian Church in Stillwater, Oklahoma. And the church building sits like right around the corner from our house. It's literally a 5-minute walk to get there to the church. And so from time to time, me and the kids will grab some bikes and scooters, and we'll go on a ride up to the church. And there's a playground there, and so we'll get there, and the kids will play around on the playground for a little bit, and then after that, we'll ride back to our house. And so we were doing that on this day, and it was one of those kind of chilly spring days where it's just cool enough that you want to wear a jacket when you go outside, but after you get moving around a little bit, you get warmed up, and so you don't need it anymore. So the kids have been playing, and they've all shed their jackets when they're playing there on the playground and play around for a little bit, and it's time to go back. And the kids, they don't want to put the jackets on, so they ask me, would you hold our jackets for us, Dad, when we go back? And I said, yeah, that's totally fine, and we head home. Now, the issue is, as their dad, anytime we're on bikes, I want to do my best to try and stay close to all of them and keep an eye on all of them. They're still just young enough where they're kind of oblivious about things like riding out into traffic and stuff like that. And so I always want to be somewhere near all of them so I can watch them and make sure they're not getting themselves in any trouble, anything like that. But the problem is that I got these 3 different kids at 3 different ages who ride at 3 different speeds. Particularly Hadley, the youngest, the 4-year-old, she's still in the training wheel stage, and so she moves pretty slowly, and there's sometimes when she actually like stalls out, just if we're going up a hill or something, she'll just get completely stuck and stopped, and I'll have to go back and give her a little shove to get her going. Whereas the older 2, they consider every bike ride we go on to be a race, right? You remember those days with your brother and sister? It doesn't matter where we're going, just who gets there first. And that's what Ella and Hudson are always doing. So it can be difficult sometimes to keep an eye and stay close to all of them at the same time. And this is one of those particular days where as we're going, sure enough, Hadley gets stuck. She gets kind of stalled out there. And so I have to go around behind her and lay all the jackets down and give her a little bit of a running start to get her going again. And then I go back and I scoop up all the jackets that I had, and I look up. And in the meantime, in this little brief period, my older 2 have just taken off. They are gone. So far out that I call out to them to try and get them to slow down, but it's too late. They're already out of earshot, and they're moving. So now I know that I've got some ground that I'm going to have to make up. Here's the part I haven't told you yet. I don't actually own a bike. And so a lot of times when we go on these rides, in order to keep myself from expending too much energy, I'll just grab one of the kids' scooters, and I'll ride on that in order to stay with them. And I'm aware that it looks probably fairly ridiculous to all the cars going by on Richmond Road, this really busy road that goes next to us. I'm sure I look silly, this 34-year-old man on a kid's scooter riding next to them, but it's my kind of one way to make sure that I'm not sprinting the whole time and worn out when we get home. So I got this scooter, and actually the scooter that I happened to grab on this day happened to be Hadley's scooter, again, the 4-year-old. And it's this little pink and white and purple scooter with twinkling lights that sparkle when you ride on it. And so on this particular day, I'm looking a little extra ridiculous to all the people driving by, and it's about to get worse. Because I see my kids way up there, and I realize I'm gonna have to move now. So I get on and I start like pumping my leg. I'm going as fast as I can, trying to get caught up to them. And as I remember right, I've got the jackets, all their jackets in my right hand, and I'm holding onto the handlebars with my left hand. And I get going on this thing, and right about the moment where I get up to about peak speed, out of nowhere, this handle right here just pops off. So now it's me and 1 foot on a twinkling girl scooter, going across the sidewalk at a pretty high velocity here. And I'd love to tell you that in my amazing athleticism and agility that I kind of rode it out for a few seconds before tumbling gently into the grass, but it was nothing like that at all. The second that handle popped off, I went flying, and jackets went everywhere like confetti, and I went into this kind of sideways Superman dive out across the pavement. And I landed on my left side, and I remember my arm and my hip taking the brunt of it, and it hurt bad, but even in the midst of it, I kind of stumbled around for a second, and I remember my kids are up there, so I still gotta get going. I grab the scooter, I grab the jackets, and I start to sprint/limp to try and catch up with them. In the meantime, in this brief little period where I've gotten myself going and then wiped out and get all the scooters going, Hadley has actually picked up quite a bit of momentum. And so she's out in front, and she's just made the turn that goes into our neighborhood, out on that little street that goes in our neighborhood. And I look up as I'm limping forward to see her lose control and take her bike up over the curb and flip over. And so now she's out in the street on her back. And now it's going into like full panic mode, trying to figure out what to do here. And I'm hurrying as fast as I can. I look down and my arm is bleeding and I'm hurting and I'm trying to catch up to them. Fortunately, and I had no idea that this was going on, fortunately, right around this exact time, there's a guy from our church who actually lives in our neighborhood as well. And he was just about to leave, kind of coming down our street, about to leave the neighborhood, and he saw my older two riding seemingly by themselves, and he thought that was a little bit odd, and so he just kind of waited there in his truck and watched them all the way until they got around the corner, and then he watched them pull up into our driveway, kind of making sure that they got there safely. And once he saw that they were there safely, he pulled out and onto the street that Hadley happened to be on, and he saw her fall down. And see, he pulled up his truck, and he got there right at the same time that I got there. And so he was able to help me load up her bike and the scooter into the back of the truck, and I scooped Hadley up and set her on my lap, and Greg, our friend, gave us a ride like the last 200 yards home. So everything ended up working out all right. It was all fine, but it was about 60 seconds of just sheer chaos. And here's kind of the weird thing about that moment. There's a lot of weird things, but here's one of the weird things that stuck with me. In those moments, in that minute right there, that 60 seconds, there were about 1 million thoughts going through my mind. You know how that works, right? 1 million thoughts. I'm thinking about my older two who are up there, and I'm hoping that they're all right. And I'm thinking about how bad my arm hurts and how bad my hip hurts. And I'm thinking about Hadley, who's laying there on the ground trying to get up to her. And I'm thinking about trying to not let the blood get onto my clothes as I'm running. And all these things are rolling through my mind. But do you want to know the very first thing that went through my mind in that minute? It was brief. I mean, it was just this flash of a second, but before anything else went through, the first thing going through my brain, it was actually while I was still in the air, before I had even hit the ground. It was like slow motion. I remember this thought running through my brain, man, I bet I look really stupid to all these cars driving by right now. This grown man on a little girl's scooter wiping out on the pavement, I bet I look so stupid to all of these people, so ridiculous. And I looked back on that later, and I thought that was really weird. That amidst all the chaos of that moment and all the things I could have been thinking about, that the first thing to go through my mind is, what do people think of me right now? I say that that's weird. The truth is, confession. I know we just met, but I'm going to be real with you. I am by nature a bit of a people pleaser. And so thoughts like that, what do people think of me? Do they like me? Are they impressed with me? Are they pleased with me? Those kinds of thoughts go through my brain far more often than I would care to admit. It's one of those things I'm still working on, and it's one of those things that the Lord is still working on in me, one of those things I hate about myself and I wish wasn't there. We're talking this week about following Jesus, specifically through the eyes of Peter. As we watch Peter interact with Jesus, what does it look like to be a disciple, to follow Jesus? And Peter is not weird, he's an interesting guy. He's this guy with a big personality. And sometimes with big personalities come big personality flaws. So there are a lot of things that can be said about Peter, good and bad, but I gotta say this, one thing I'll give Peter right out front, one of these things I admire about him so much is that Peter does not care what people think about him. Actually, I should probably rephrase that. Peter does not think about what other people think about him. Peter's one of those guys that, like, the minute a thought enters his head, it's going to come out of his mouth. You know people like that? Some of you are people like that. Some of you are friends with people like that, and you've been in more awkward situations than you can count because of your friend like that, right? Peter's one of those guys. If a thought enters his mind, it's going to come out of his mouth. If he gets an idea, he's going to go through with it. And he doesn't really pause to consider what this might look like to other people or how they might perceive him or what this is going to be. He's just going to go for it. And sometimes this is a really good thing. There are times when this leads to some amazing moments of triumph for Peter, where he stands out above the crowd, doing the right thing, doing the thing that needs to be done. And then there are other moments where this leads to some really embarrassing failures for Peter. And then there are other times when it leads to both of those things in the span of less than a minute. That's what happens in our story today. Matthew 14 is where we're at today. And we've actually jumped ahead quite a bit from last night's story. Matthew 14, by this time, the disciples have been with Jesus roughly 2 years. They've been with him a lot. They have traveled all over the Galilean countryside with him. They've listened to him speak and teach, and they've watched him do incredible things, and they've seen him interact with the crowds and the religious leaders and all this. They've been around him a lot, but they still don't quite got him figured out yet. They still can't get their arms around who this guy really is and what he's all about. Now, listen, they know that there's something special about him. They know he's unique. There's something different about this Jesus. In fact, in the story just before ours, Matthew 14, we see that Jesus feeds 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and just 2 fish. This miraculous multiplying of the food. So the disciples know there's something different about this guy, but they can't quite seem to put their finger on it. Who is he? What is he about? And they're going to get a pretty good chance to figure out more in our story here today. Matthew 14, verse 22 says this. Immediately, this is right after feeding the 5,000, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of them to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. So Jesus sends his disciples out across the Sea of Galilee. There we go. Sends his disciples out across the lake here, and they start to make their way across. He says, I'll meet you on the other side. And they go across, and then Matthew says this great wind comes down and starts pushing against the boat. More than likely, it was a storm of some kind. Because Galilee, the Sea of Galilee actually sits in this valley right there, surrounded by all these hills and mountains. And it wasn't uncommon for storms to develop up on the top of these things and then sweep unexpectedly down into the sea. And so the disciples are making their way across the sea, and they run into this storm, and they cannot make any headway. And then we read this in verse 25. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. I don't know if you guys ever think about like the miracles of Jesus and which ones you would really like to see. This one for me, if I could witness any of the miracles of Jesus, firsthand eyewitness account, this would definitely be top 5. Walking on the water, to see Jesus out on the surface of the waves would have just been incredible. But I have to confess to you, this miracle is also a little bit odd. See, Jesus never does miracles randomly or arbitrarily. He never does things just for his own personal convenience. Like, you'll never see Jesus create a horse so he can ride it from one village to the next. That's just not how he works. No, Jesus' miracles always do 2 things. First of all, they reveal something about him and his kingdom. And second, they tend to always benefit other people. And so when Jesus heals a sick person, it's revealing that Jesus is a man who has control over sickness, and his kingdom is a place of wholeness and restoration. And not only that, but a person gets healed. They're made well. They benefit from this. But this miracle, walking on the water, does not seem to fit those criteria. At least not at first glance. Who benefits from this? It seems a whole lot like some party trick that Jesus is doing. Hey, check this out, guys. Look what I can do. So then why does he do it? The story continues in 26. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. Now, you need to know, in the Jewish mindset in the first century, the sea is a chaotic and sometimes even scary place for a lot of them. It's this place where human beings don't have control. When something like a storm comes up, there's not much that they can do about it. And you also got to know, this is before, of course, submarines and scuba equipment. So they don't really know what sits under the surface of the water. They just know that most people, when they go down, they don't come back up. And so they believed the sea to be this kind of scary place. And there was actually a number of superstitions about the sea being a place where evil spirits dwelled. And so here the disciples are in the middle of the night in a storm, and this figure comes out to them across the lake, seeming to be floating above the waves. And you can understand how terrified they are. See, in this moment, they see Jesus, but they don't see Jesus. They see something else. They see a ghost, and so they're terrified. But it says, verse 27, but Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. So Jesus responds to them, but his response is kind of interesting. See, you may know this, that the New Testament is written in the Greek originally, and then it was translated into English and other language so we could understand it. When Jesus says these words, take courage, it is I, that phrase, it is I, in the Greek, it's ego eimi. And it is I, that's a pretty good translation of it. You can legitimately translate ego eimi into those words, it is I. But more literally, this is what those words ego eimi mean. I am. Take courage, Jesus says, I am. Now that's not the only time that Jesus used that phrase. There's this other story where Jesus is arguing with this crowd about Abraham in John 8. And in the middle of the argument, the crowd says to him, do you really believe that you're better than Abraham? And Jesus says this to them, I tell you the truth, before Abraham was born, I am, ego eimi. And as soon as he says that, the crowds all start to bend down and they start scooping up rocks. And they're about to stone him for blasphemy because they know what he just did. Ego eimi, I am, that's the name of God. That's the name that God uses in the Old Testament to describe himself. And they know that when Jesus is using that phrase for himself, he's using the name of God for himself. That's blasphemy in their eyes. He's claiming to be God. I think that that's what Jesus is doing here in Matthew 14 with his disciples when he says, I am. But that's not the only clue he's giving them, actually. See, there's this verse in Job 9, and I don't know how well the disciples were paying attention in synagogue school when they came to Job 9:38, but Job 9:8, it says this, God alone stretches out the heavens and tramples the waves of the sea. So here Jesus is trampling the waves of the sea and calling out to his disciples, I am. This is no party trick. He is revealing his identity to them in this moment. And here's the thing, now they see him. Now they see it's Jesus, but they still don't really see him. They still don't really see who he is revealing himself to be with them. And then Peter gets this crazy idea. And like we said, when Peter gets an idea, he's not going to think it through. He's just going to go for it. And so this is what Matthew tells us in verse 28. Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. Come, Jesus said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. Now, this is an amazing moment, one of the highlights in Peter's life. Peter is the only person other than Jesus who can say that he has ever walked on water. This is this incredible moment of triumph for him, and it lasts about 10 seconds.
It says in verse 30, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. So Peter starts to go down, but notice when it happens, it says, when he saw the wind. That is, when Peter started looking around at the storm around him, when he took his eyes off Jesus, he starts to go down. And what is happening to Peter physically in this moment is a really great illustration for what's happening in his heart. That he is so distracted by all the things around him that he's failing to see Jesus for who he is in this moment. Matthew continues, immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. So Jesus reaches out, saves him, and says, why did you doubt? But he's not talking to him about self-doubt. He's not saying, why didn't you believe in yourself? No, he's saying, why did you doubt me? Why didn't you see who I am and able to do these things? Why did you not trust me? And then they climb into the boat, and Matthew says, when they do that, the waves and the wind, it all dies down. Now, this is actually clue number 3 for the disciples. See, there's this verse, Psalm 89:9 says this about God, you rule over the surging sea, and when its waves mount up, you still them. So here Jesus is, trampling the waves of the sea, calling out, I am, doing things that only God is supposed to be able to do. He is showing himself to them. And Matthew shows us in verse 33, then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. This now is the big moment, right? Now they see him. Now they get him clearly. Yes and no. The truth is that this is the most clear view that they have had of Jesus up to this point. But if you read through the Gospels, you'll see pretty quickly that they still don't quite get him. In fact, when Mark tells this story in his Gospel, he finishes the story by saying this, and they still did not understand because their hearts were hardened. Think about that for just a second. Think about how much time these men have spent with Jesus up to this point. 2 years walking through the Galilean countryside with him. 2 years watching him do amazing things, hearing him teach amazing things, spending almost every waking moment of their life with him, and they still don't see him. Which leads me to this really scary thought that it is possible to be this close to Jesus and still miss him. It's possible to spend 2 years walking a Galilean countryside with this man and still miss him. It's possible to grow up in church all your life singing songs to Jesus every Sunday morning and hearing Bible stories and still not see him clearly. It's possible to go to events like this with a bunch of friends and to surround yourself with Christian people who know Jesus and follow him and still not see him yourself. How? How does that happen? I think that there are a number of different ways that can take place, but there are these 3 things I kind of want to focus on as we wrap up this morning. 3 specific things that we see take place in the gospel that keep people from seeing Jesus as he is. The first is this, a fear of losing control or power. And we see this with the religious and political leaders of Jesus' day. These are the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the chief priests who have all the influence and all the authority and all the power there in Palestine, and they love it. But when this new rabbi named Jesus steps on the scene, people start turning to him, and they hate that idea. They fear so badly losing control of the people, so much so that it does not matter what Jesus does or what Jesus says, their hearts simply cannot let them see him as he is. Now, I know that for most of us in here, we don't have to worry about having a lot of political or religious power, right? But we still have to face this question because the truth is, if Jesus is who he says he is, then following him will mean for every one of us giving up control. It will mean laying down our rights to our life, laying down our own authority and power, and there are a whole lot of people
who are so afraid of that their eyes simply cannot be opened to seeing Jesus because they cannot lose control. Is that you? Another thing that keeps people from seeing Jesus properly is their own presuppositions of what Jesus really is and what he ought to be. Like for the disciples, this is true, and for the crowds. The Jewish people back then, they had their own concept of who the Messiah was and what he was supposed to be. That he was going to be this political, military ruler who was going to raise up a physical army and throw off the chains of Rome and set up Israel as this amazing kingdom, and he was going to put his throne in Jerusalem and build a palace there and make Israel amazing again. This is what the Messiah was supposed to do. And they were so set on that. They believed that so deeply that when the real Messiah came and stood right in front of him, they missed him. Is that you? Do you have this preconception of who Jesus is that is so locked in your brain that Jesus would never judge anyone for the way they live? He would never tell someone to change their life or to do something different. He would never judge. Jesus is only always nice all the time. Or maybe a Jesus that cares most, first and foremost, about America and our nation and prospering us and making us great. Or maybe you have a Jesus that only cares about your political ideologies and your social causes, and everyone against that is evil and wicked. I'm telling you, if you've got a Jesus like that, when the real one stands right in front of you, you're going to miss him. Lastly is what the Gospels just call concerns and worries for this life. Jesus tells this story about people who receive the gospel into their hearts and they get really excited at first, but then worries for this life, the desire to get rich, the desire to be successful, the desire to be famous, those things come in and choke it out and keep them from really growing, keep them from really seeing Jesus properly. Sometimes it's not like bad things we do, it's just bad things happening to us. Sometimes life is rough and we go through difficult things and those things aren't our fault, but it can get so easy to fix our eyes on those things so that we don't actually see Jesus in the process. We lose sight of him. So here's my question for you. Do any of those things describe you this week? And if so, are you willing to do whatever it takes to put those aside so you can see him? I believe this. I believe that Jesus wants to reveal himself to you this week. No matter where you are in your walk with Jesus, whether you've been walking with him for years or you're right at the beginning of this thing, maybe you don't even know what you think about Jesus yet. Maybe you're not even sure about this whole thing. Wherever you are, I believe that Jesus, through the preaching and teaching of his word, through discussions that you're going to have in your small group, through videos and singing and all that Jesus wants to give you a clearer picture of himself this week. And can I tell you this? That is what you were made for. To see him, to know him, to be changed by him. It's one of the most amazing things that could happen in your life. So I leave you with this challenge this morning that whatever you do this week, whatever it may take from you, when Jesus stands up in front of you, do not miss him. Let me pray that very prayer for us this morning as we go out. Dear Father, I pray that over us, that your Holy Spirit would come and do what only he can do, and that is open our eyes and help us see Jesus as he is. I pray for people here that might be distracted by various things, that might be blinded to the reality of Jesus, to seeing him clearly. And I pray, Lord, that you would remove whatever it is that is blinding them, that your Holy Spirit would open us up, that you would help us to see Jesus as he is and to be changed by him. I ask you that in the name of Jesus. Amen.